Welcome to Talk Dust, the podcast that gives you a front row seat into some of the best classrooms in the world. I'm Dr. Nathaniel Swain.
And I'm Rebecca Birch.
I'm a teacher and an instructional coach, and I have the great privilege of working with schools around the country on their instructional practice and school improvement.
And I'm currently academic in residence at a girls' school in Sydney. I'm an English teacher, and I'm also completing a PhD into how explicit instruction supports student wellbeing.
We're adding our voices to the growing conversations nationally and internationally about evidence-informed practice, but with a distinctive focus.
So what sets Chalk Dust apart? Each episode features expert commentary and authentic classroom footage. You can listen wherever you get your podcasts, but the real experience is when you watch along for all the detail on Substack or YouTube.
You might choose to share an episode with your department or use it to spark discussion in professional learning sessions. If you or your school find the podcast valuable, a simple like or follow can help Chalk Dust reach a greater audience and get to more teachers.
And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands I'm recording from and those where you may be listening. Here in Sydney, I acknowledge the Gadigal people and pay my respect to elders past and present.
And I pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, on whose lands we're recording today.
And today we are very excited to be joined by a very special guest. Denarius Frazier is a nationally recognised education leader and co-author of Reconnect, Building School Culture for Meaning, Purpose and Belonging. He serves as Regional Superintendent of Instruction for Uncommon Schools in New York City and a Senior Advisor on the Teach Like a Champion Consulting and Partnerships team. A former high school principal and Teach for America Corps member, Frazier was named High School Principal of the Year in 2022. His classrooms are featured in more than 30 Teach Like a Champ training videos, and they're studied globally as models of rigorous, joyful teaching that foster meaning, purpose, and belonging. And we have certainly been fans of your work for quite some time, haven't we, Nathaniel?
Definitely. A big welcome from us, Denarius.
Yes. Great.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. So what we're going to watch today is a video that compares Denarius's practices, so same practice like for like, with a teacher in the UK, Matthew Gray. And we're going to pause after each one. So if you're watching online, you'll be able to see the little annotations come up naming each practice. It is really worth seeing these ones, I think, on the video version, but audio will do just fine. So are we ready to watch?
Yes, we are.
So we're about 85% of the way there for problem number one in the you do two. I'm coming around to check the quotient. Can you please answer on the sheet? I'm going to come around in about 1 minute. I'm going to be ticking number one first. And then on my second tour, I'm going to be looking at 2, 3, 4, and 5.
So I noticed in areas that you're moving very quickly. Does the narrating help with the expectations that you're trying to build and the purpose for moving around the room and doing that first lap?
Yeah, I think what we call naming the lap or a circulation lap is like twofold. I think the first is to be transparent with students about what we expect to be on their papers. And so there's a behavioral expectation that we expect you to have pen and paper and be working actively as a collective class. And then I think for those students, the second one is the academic support. And so maybe you're stuck or maybe you're not sure. Maybe you've given it a go for an extended amount of time and you just find yourself lost. This like academic circulation lap that is named by the teacher gives you focus of what they're looking for, which tells you a little bit more about like where you should be headed. It's not unfolding the process or giving the answer, but rather giving you the ballpark of what you should be doing on your paper to get there. I think that sometimes in teaching, we can mistake achievement for activity, right? And so just because a student looks busy, we think that they're on task and doing the work, and you get to their work and it's actually the quite opposite. And so I think by naming our laps, we're setting the expectation, giving kids an opportunity to meet that expectation while also driving them to mastery in whatever task that they're working on.
So I love this because it gives teachers a really tangible way that they can do active monitoring of independent practice, which if people who are familiar with Rosenshine's principles, some evidence-based principles to inform great teaching, it's about monitoring that independent practice. But this is a way that you can actually do it rather than just wandering around and hoping for the best, which I'm thinking is probably more standard practice.
Yeah. And Nate, it's interesting you brought up Rosenshine's there because I actually do sometimes when I'm giving professional learning kind of skip that bit. Like, oh, of course you monitor, but I don't give a lot of information about what that might look like. And I never really thought about monitoring as a coachable moment.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Until I saw this and I thought, okay, yeah, no, if you're an experienced teacher, some of this might be kind of automatic. But if you're an inexperienced teacher, you're not necessarily doing that sort of narration that makes the sort of intentions really transparent. So I really never thought about it in that light before.
And I think supporting as well, and you can tell me if I'm on the right track here, Denarius, but supporting students' executive functioning as they proceed through a series of questions or tasks is one of the added benefits here, is you're giving those cues or those prompts that ideally they'll eventually internalize for themselves.
Yeah, I think also, like, if I think back to when I was a student, my teachers didn't really do this, right? We got feedback on homework or on assessments, like when they returned them, you saw whether you got the answer or not. I think nowadays it's kind of a modern practice to ensure each kid experiences success before the end of the lesson, right? And so one way to do that is to think about the ways in which we can give them feedback sooner so that they can get to mastery by the end of the lesson, so that once they get to the homework or the assessment, they're practicing more authentically with that process, maybe at different rigorous kind of problems. And so I find that like this process is like creating a practical model alongside a mental model of when the introduction is done for them to experience success, which I think ultimately allows us to build the strongest relationships with kids when they can say, I learned from so-and-so today, right? Beyond like going to the basketball games and the football games and building the trust and rapport outside of the classroom, we actually build trust and rapport through competence and content. And one of the ways we do that is to say, as a learner, you will be successful in my class. One of the ways I can ensure that you're successful is by giving you feedback at every moment that you are practicing independently of me.
I would love that.
That's exactly what my PhD research is on. So thank you. Very validating.
That was well timed.
All right. So should we watch the next one? Yep.
Should you have the remainder in that quotient? What's going on here?
Yeah, 6.
Yeah, so make sure that your work is aligned vertically so that it's clear to the reader. That's good. Good.
So he does that to the servants. What is this? Yep, nailed it. Nailed it. Good man. Well done.
That's good. Pencil down, track me in 3, 2, and 1. Wait, no one. So as I walk around on a few of our papers, I'm noticing that we're getting an incorrect remainder, but we have check mechanisms in place to check this. There's multiple strategies that we can use. So snaps first for Fagan for using long division. You didn't have to use long division. You don't have to use synthetic. There's even another approach that I saw in Kiegetta's paper. But what's a way that we can quickly check if this remainder is correct?
Do you mind? Great. Okay, let's have a very quick look at Ilias. Okay, Ilias got 3 and 4 correct, as did everyone I saw. 5, however, there was disagreement in the room. So 5, there was disagreement in the room. Ilias has made a mistake, which is absolutely fine, because I made it difficult on purpose. Ilias has made the same mistake that 7 other people in the room who have also made, but it's the mistake that I made whenever I first read the poem. So this is not correct. Nana, why is A wrong? He doesn't know, but he assumed.
What we just saw there was each teacher monitoring the work as they went around the room, giving little bits of feedback, and then pulling together some common errors for discussion at the front of the class. And Denarius, when I look at your practice versus Matthew's, I see I would call yours a minimalist approach. It seems like that sort of culture of error is really normalized and very neutrally delivered, so your tone does not change in the way you give feedback. Whereas I see Matthew working really quite hard to make that culture of error really prominent, to sort of point out how many students made that same error, even how many errors, that he made a particular error as a teacher when he first engaged with that particular text. So my question to you, I guess, is, do you think that's a function of school culture, or is that something perhaps more to do with teachers' personal style in the way that they deliver that?
I think it can be both, if I'm being realistic, but I think that one of the things that I considered when I watched this, and even just seeing Matthew and studying his practice, is just systems and routines, like in a classroom, which are really important. And I think that within systems and routines, something starts as a procedure. This is a reoccurring task that you want kids to do every single day. And that procedure becomes kind of a norm when it's internalized by kids and they know what to do. And then it becomes a routine when it is habitual and it can be done independently of the teacher. And I think the routines actually are what we're trying to get to. And so what I see when I see these classrooms side by side is a practice in my classroom that's probably on day 50, whereas in Matthew classroom, I would argue this is probably like day 10. And so he is still trying to install the system and routine of culture of error. And what that means is that there's going to be newness to this approach with kids. And as they start to do it more, it'll become more automatic and it'll be a norm in the classroom. Whereas on day 50, this is something that kids have probably seen 50 times and they have it. So I think actually it's not just about culture, but also where we are in building the habit with kids. And I just think that in my clip, I happen to be further along on my habit journey with students than Matthew is. But I would argue if we were to go to his classroom back in April, you would probably see it mirroring that of mine more. I would say the other thing too is that these are data informed. I think that's the purpose and power of collecting data, right? When I'm walking around the classroom, what I'm noticing is that mastery is actually quite high. And so I am doing a show call for sophistication, right? That assumes that more students in the room are correct and on the right path. When Matthew's walking around, he names that the first 2 kids got right, but then they struggled on a problem. And so even when I see that kids are struggling, that means that they're going to be a little bit more apprehensive to engage because most of them were wrong. And so aside from it even being like maybe we're just in different places in building the habit with kids, I also think that the data in which is informing the show call for Matthew is quite different than the data of mine.
And what's great about this is that it gives teachers a tangible way that they can be responsive to what they're seeing in the classroom. So this is, you know, how you use your show call, for example, which is a really powerful technique with the visualizer you have there, which is not as much very common in Australia. I would say they don't have those document cameras very frequently available. They're not new technology, but highly valuable for this kind of work. Is that teachers can basically decide what that show call or what that sort of review of the do now or the task you're doing is going to look like based on the data that they've been systematically tracking, which is, I think, really, I think, reassuring for teachers who say, I don't know exactly what I should be doing here. Well, it'll fall out of what you see when you walk around, which is why you're walking around.
Yeah, so I think to your point there, it's like some of the things that we do as teachers can feel kind of perfunctory, right? They lack purpose or intention, or maybe a kid doesn't know why you're doing it. And when you show call the work in this way, it's like, actually, I'm studying what you all do. I remember because I write it down, what I see on work, and it honors their work. I think sometimes when we think about building belonging or inclusivity in classrooms, we think about it being non-academic based or not anchored in the lesson that we're teaching. But when I put a kid's work under the doc cam, I'm saying like, I see you, I value you, I appreciate you, but also I'm reading what you put on your paper. And when it's great, I want to celebrate that. And when I see a trend, I want us to come together and talk more about it. And so I think the culture of error is built in this way, because you're right. I probably wasn't show calling my first or second year nearly as much as I would do now. Like I'm probably trying to show call on average once every lesson, just because I think that there's power in us studying work together, but also lifting the voices of the people in the class.
I like that point about belonging. I think there's a misconception that it's about talking to kids about their pets and their holidays and things like that. So building belonging is more and less than people think at the same time.
Yes.
So say you have some extra time, what's the way you can check? Kenyatta?
You plug in what the 0 would be and see if it equals 0.
And what theorem is she using there, Isaiah? And so if we plugged in 3, substituted 3 in for our function, we get what? And so that conclusion would tell us that something in our work is incorrect, because when we use the remainder theorem, we know that the remainder should be 248. Okay, just go back to practice.
It is wrong because there's no evidence that anybody was actually seducing the Duchess.
If you didn't get it, write what Dan said. Dan, repeat.
A is wrong because there is no evidence that anybody was actually seducing the Duchess.
Okay, great.
So the question I had about, I guess, the culture of error overall is how much of this is actually at the school level and not just the individual teacher level? Because what we have often in Australia is teachers who are trying to do these practices, but without that support of the whole school culture. So they don't necessarily have a behavior policy that's followed through on. They don't necessarily have entry routines for every class. So students come to the one class and have an entry routine, and that teacher struggles to get any traction with norms because they are the only teacher in their school trying to get those norms happening.
Yeah, I would say at the school that I started teaching at and at the schools that I lead, there is a shared norm around like cultural systems, classroom routines. And so the way we enter a classroom in 9th grade Algebra 1 is the same way you enter the classroom in 12th grade government. And so I do think that there is power in the consistency. And even if it's not amongst the whole school, it being within a department or within a grade, I think is really important because what we're really thinking about here is teenage brain development or kid brain development. And we know that that's really important to the science of the techniques that we use. And no matter what research you use or you look at, we know that kids thrive off of predictability. And so the more predictable the structures are, the better they will do. And we see that from infantry all the way up until the college life, right? If we can tell kids and they know our expectations and they know the why, they're more successful. And so I think what we're really trying to do when we think about alignment across a school or grade is create predictability. And so if I go to math class and I have this one structure and that structure is different from English, which is different for science, now I'm living a kind of like chaotic day in the teenage brain. And so now my day doesn't feel predictable. And so I feel like I'm not successful just because of the nature of how my day is socialized to be. And so I think that there is more success when there is a shared purpose, even if that means like, hey, let's have a few people try this. And so when we tried the technique active observation that we call in Teach Like a Champion 3.0, I actually was piloting it myself as a math teacher in our school. But I think what started to happen is we actually created a think tank and other teachers started to model it as well, which I think allowed us to accelerate learning. Because when I was doing it, I felt like I was, failing in a vacuum in isolation. But when other people started to do it, I started to see it from a different perspective. I began to start to watch someone else's practice and say, wow, you actually implemented this in a slightly nuanced way that I never thought of. Let me try it here. Oh, does it work in math? Does it work in history? And so I do think that while not impossible to do it in an isolated form to study, I think you just get more out of it when it is a shared norm amongst multiple people.
Great. Exactly as I had expected you would say. It's no surprise, is it? Norms are much more powerful when they're across lots of different domains. Would you mind introducing Julia, just because you're going to know more about her and her class than we will?
Yes. Julia is a great friend of mine. Julia Adio, at the time of this clip, is a math teacher in the math department chair. For a number of years, she's been a math instructor in Newark, New Jersey with Uncommon Schools. And so she is just a math enthusiast and loves learning about math. And so in this clip, she's a 10th grade math teacher in Newark, New Jersey with North Star Academy, which is also an Uncommon School.
Okay, 45 more seconds to wrap up. Number 2 is what I'm really looking for. Check this x cubed term. X cubed minus x squared plus this line looks good, so something happened here. So same thing, x cubed term, 9x minus x squared plus 3. This looks good, so something's happening in this multiplication. Okay, let's bring it back together in 3, 2, and 1. Number 1 looks excellent. We're not going to spend too much time going over that. 4x squared minus 14x plus 6. Just one piece of feedback. Trap up here. If I just wrote what I have on the board right now, what feedback would you give to appear? Steve?
Each equation, and right now you have an expression, and so you have to have the y equals 4x squared minus 14x plus 6, because it's not the same thing. You can just write it in standard form.
Very nice. Thank you for using the vocabulary expression versus equation. Ansel, please give Steve a point. Let's talk about number 2. Almost 100% of us focused on simplifying these two binomials first. Once you simplify the first two binomials, what expression did you get there? Don't combine like terms or anything. Just give me the next line. Rose?
3x to the third power plus 9x and x squared minus 3.
What's the sign in between 9x? Minus x squared and then?
Minus 3.
Good. So now what am I doing with this expression here? Connie?
Multiply it by the remaining binomial.
Which is?
2x plus 5.
Good. Okay, so now what, this looked excellent, and then our algebra broke down and simplifying further. So what do we need to keep in mind when we're multiplying this expression that is now no longer a binomial by this binomial here? Name that with your partner now. Go.
So based on the previous videos, I gathered that with your coaching, you encourage people to sort of plan for these opportunities. But when Julia actually gets into addressing misconceptions and they're almost co-constructing an answer, so they're using self-explanation and almost like co-constructing a response as a class, that's all her responding in the moment. So I just wondered if you could talk about what this looks like for a new teacher versus a really experienced teacher. Because when I saw this, I was like, okay, I supervise early career teachers and initial teacher education students at my school, and this would completely overwhelm them. The prospect of doing this is where they fall down. So like dealing with incorrect answers and getting better answers out of students. Can you talk a little bit about how someone actually gets to this level of mastery?
Yeah. It's so funny that you said that, because I used to struggle with it myself. I mean, I think it's just so complex, but as I'm watching it now with a new vantage point, I'm like, yes, that makes sense. Yes, that makes sense. The truth is, it's all predictable, right? And I think that, like, before I even share more on that, I think one of the things that we've been trying to do over at TLAC is think about human cognition and think about the cognitive science behind what wires the techniques. And Daniel Willingham has this book called Why Don't Kids Like School? And in it, it's probably the simplest model of how the brain works. And the model summarizes what is like simply about how we actually think, which is quite profound to me. And I think the most important part of the brain, I'm not a doctor, so don't quote me on that, is working memory. And I think working memory is the thinking you are aware that you're doing. And it's incredibly powerful and capable of amazing things like writing Hamlet or inventing penicillin. But I think one of the drawbacks and problems is that it's very tiny and easily overloaded. And so when we think about a teacher, I think there was an article one time that I read that says we make over 1,500 decisions per lesson. And so we're trying to think about how we can not overload the working memory so that we have space to listen, space to think in the moment. And so I think what we're seeing in Julia's class seemingly looks very complicated, but it's actually pretty predictable. And it's all informed by mastery. And so when we teach response to data as a byproduct of the active observation that we do when we're working around the class that we saw in Matthew's classroom, one of the things that we've explored is how mastery can inform the response structure that you actually do. And so in the back of our heads, and usually on the back of our clipboards, it's kind of like a graphic organizer. And it says something along the lines, if mastery or proficiency in the classroom is less than 50%, here's the strategy that we're going to do. We are going to simply reteach at the point of error because there's not enough mastery in the room for us to have productive discussion and dialogue about a specific problem or a concept. If mastery falls between, say, 50% and 70%, we may do what we call a comparative show call, where we're going to place an exemplar next to a non-exemplar. And because at least 50% of the classroom has mastered it, they're going to be able to look at those two examples and say, I know why this is right and this is wrong, and that is fruitful to push the rest of the class forward to mastery. Now, if mastery is above 80%, the teacher may have a slight choice. Either you want to continue to the next round of practice and let kids just go, or you can say, let's do something we call an almost there show call. So I'm going to, put under the document camera just a small error, and I'm just expecting to see if kids can spot it and move on. And so these type of response structures, which seem like they're just master teacher or they're artful, are actually informed by mastery. And the reality is that when you watch Julia, when you watch Matthew, when you watch me, most of the times you're going to hear us name the data at the end of the lap. And almost always, if you find that the data falls within these thresholds, you're going to get that response. And so when I'm watching Julia, what's nice is that she's naming this lap that she's looking for this particular line in the problem solving process. She gets to these two young ladies in the classroom and she has to give the same feedback twice. And then she starts to write it down because maybe it's an anticipated gap, maybe it's one that she didn't anticipate. And then when she goes at the end of the lap, she's targeting that same thing, which probably indicates that that gap was pervasive around the room. But if it's pervasive around the room, what I think Julia is doing in the moment is she's remodeling, because mastery is less than 50%, because she names the things that they got right. She pauses them exactly where they got it wrong. And then they go into this turn and talk that lifts the floor. And now she's trying to see if the gap is really closed based on check for understanding questions, and then being able to articulate why or what the problem solving process is based on where they went wrong. And so I think that we're trying to make teaching kind of like an art, but it's also a science in that we can make it predictable. I think that for a long time, we were trying to dispel what do you do and what's best, and how do you maximize time while also maximizing learning. And one way that we found is by first landing on the level of proficiency in the room and allowing that to kind of like guide us. And I think over time, it took me maybe like a year to get to this place, because I'm like, what if you do an almost there show call with less than 50% mastery? What happens if you try to do a comparative show call and you have a really high mastery? And so I started to see the pros and the cons therein. And I think we landed in this threshold that's still, albeit not perfect, but more or less when you have these level of masteries, these response to data structures helps us close the gap and get kids back to practice the fastest.
What I love about that is that these heuristics are also a way for teachers to, I guess, take that learning that you would have taken a year to figure out and to apply it to their classroom faster. So this sort of, these rules of thumb, if you like, are a way for teachers to get going with these kinds of responsive instructions, but not in a way that's random, as you're saying, but in a way that's highly predictable, that does manage their own working memory. I also love the monitoring tool that Julia had as well that she was using. She could have held the whole problem in her head, but instead she had the problem worked out and was looking for something in particular and comparing back and forth between problems and her worked example. And that's also, as I can see, a way of managing her own cognitive load so that she can focus on what the kids are doing rather than trying to remember, what was that step and what was I up to? As you said, it's not all art here. There is some artfulness to the way it's deployed. And of course, there's always more to play with. It's actually highly systematic and predictable, as you're saying, which for most people looking at it, like the audience of this podcast, they might think, well, however would I get there? And I think there is a way to get there.
Yeah, and you plan for it. I think like what you said resonates a lot with me. I think when I first started to like prepare to teach, I would believe that I was being scored or evaluated if I looked at my plan or if I looked at my prep. And it's like, no, the prep is that's exactly what it's there for. In earlier days of active observation, I didn't walk around with my key and I tried to memorize the entire problem solving process. Who is this helping? If you did the prep, it's for that purpose. And I think that when we look at cognitive science and studying, it's like the process of forgetting that we're trying to counteract as we're teaching. And so every moment that you forget, just go to the tool. No one's penalizing you for using the tool. And so I love that in this moment, we see Julia look back at her work and say, I'm looking at this one line of computations and I want to make sure it matches there. They're missing this portion. That's what the feedback is going to be. And I think that preparation cannot be overemphasized, that allows us to maximize the working memory when we're in front of kids.
Okay, let's bring it back together in 3, 2, and 1. Track and mirror.
Well, I multiplied. Well, I broke down the 2x plus 5, and then I multiplied 2x times the 3x to the third 3x to the third power plus 9x minus x squared minus 3. And
what is a mirror really doing here? Hilda?
Distributing the binomial to the other expression.
So be more specific in what she's distributing. She's distributing the whole binomial? Go ahead.
Each term.
Say it again.
She's distributing each term in the binomial to the other expression. That's not a trinomial. It's 4. So
We're going to call that a polynomial.
oh yeah.
We're going to talk about that today, but thank you for bringing that up. What sign does the mirror need to include in front of the 5 here? Ansel?
Plus.
Right. So stop and jot on your paper. If you didn't write it the way that Amira wrote it here, I'd like to see that on everyone's papers. Because we're going to go through this quickly to make sure that we feel confident about the algebra that this requires, because we're going to be using this a lot today. So take 20 seconds to get a head start on the multiplication. And then I'm going to go through this very quickly with you all, okay? 20 more seconds.
So Denarius, tell me a bit more about this class. Is there a danger with students hearing wrong or partially wrong answers, or is the self-explanation factor really worthwhile as they try and work their way through and reason through the problem?
Yeah. I thought about this for some time, like, ooh, is there a danger in hearing the wrong answer? And where I ultimately landed is like, we don't want to shield kids from a false reality. And the reality is that there's going to be wrong answers. We're not always going to be right because we're human. And I think that when we bring the humanity into the classroom, it makes us better learners. And so I think that in this moment, it's not about whether the answer is right or wrong. It's about what we do in response to wrongness or response to error. And I think that what we're doing is creating a growth mindset with our students to say, like, it's not about if you make a mistake, it's what we do after we have the mistake that ultimately matters, because you have an opportunity to try it again. It's almost like you're calmly inviting them to say, make the error with me, or make it in the lesson, or make it when we're doing practice before you get to the assessment, before you leave my classroom, before you go into the world and experience all of the other places and errors where maybe like some errors have consequences, right? Some errors, there is no grace or forgiveness after you make them. And so I think on a like more tactical level, but also on a more socialized level, I think them hearing errors is really important for them to realize that, like, no, we're going to make errors. And I think we can learn from them. I think the ultimate form of thinking and think ratio is actually error analysis. Like, I don't want to just know, can you articulate it and can you write it? Can you find an error in someone's work and then fix it? That really tells me that you have a high level of mastery that's internalized when you can do those things. And so I think in this classroom, seeing the error allows us to say, like, hey, I made this error. Oh, my heart just dropped because the teacher is showing my error. But it's actually like, I said 50% of us made this error in the classroom. So you're not alone, sweetheart, in the corner, like other people did this. But also because so many people got this wrong, and you can hear Julia saying, like, making connections to the day's lesson, it's valuable for us to get this right now because we're going to need it in about 10 minutes for our lesson. It's kind of like, I also care. I care that we fix this. I care that there's an urgency. I care that there's a speed. And so I look at all of our techniques as like, what is the purpose as to why I'm doing this right now? And then how do I message it to kids in a way that it's productive for us, right? And I find that the residue of every technique that I use or everything that I try to do is belonging. And it's like, how do we build inclusivity with all learners in the classroom? And I think, Doug Lamov and my colleagues at TLAC, we wrote a book about this called Reconnect. And so we're always trying to think about how do we center belonging in the classroom. And I think that this is just one of those ways. And so to answer your question in short, yes, we should talk about error. And I don't think that there's a danger about the error itself. I think if we talk about it in a way, or, the way you present it or the way you normalize it in your class can have pros and cons. Because, of course, if you just put it up there and kids start bullying each other or they start to shame people because they made errors, it could definitely have an adverse effect. But I think if we frame it well, if we tell kids why we're doing it, then they can latch on to it and see the value of it.
Great. I don't know if you're aware, but we have the most disruptive classroom behavior in the OECD. That came out
low level, but constant.
Yeah, low level, constant. So we've got sort of cultural issues, I think, around that. And one of the things that I think is key to this practice actually working is that every student is actually following the conversation. So they're not dipping in and out with their attention. If they do dip in and out, they might just hear the error and then not hear the correction part, or, you know, they might sort of lose the whole thread of where Julia's going with her explanation. So I think that's actually something that makes it work, is that all the students are actually following. We're following a thread of errors, and it's going to land on the correct answer at some point, but we're going to talk through all that thinking. And it's something that I think in Australia, some teachers would struggle with just within their school context.
I think setting up that culture that you've obviously got in a lot of your TLAC and uncommon school classrooms is that there is expectations around, and strong expectations around, focus, attention, listening to others. Obviously SLANT and other sort of acronyms can help teachers to sort of teach that really effectively. Is there a way, I guess, for people to enter that work if they haven't ever had high expectations for focus and attention before?
Yeah, I highly recommend the Teach Like a Champion 3.0. There's a technique in there called habits of attention. I think it's arguably the most important. I don't want to understate it, that like systems and routines and productive classroom culture is the prerequisite for rigor and for learning to happen. We spend, 3 weeks over the summer training all of our teachers before kids come back. Right. We have walkthroughs of our school with expert leaders within the first 21 days to make sure culture is in a place that we want. And I think that is why you see the videos look the way they do, because we are really invested in things like the what to do cycle and what to do directions. We're really invested in like having a shared expectation of what happens when kids don't follow expectations, and communicating those to students, to teachers, and to families so that we're all on the same page. I think that that is the bread and butter, or the hallmark of what we do is classroom culture. And I think that we certainly see that classrooms that don't have the culture set are not able to reach learning outcomes as the classrooms that do. And so I would argue that without culture, none of this is possible. And I've experienced that even as a first year teacher, trying to get my classroom to mimic that of some of the more tenured teachers in my building. But I think what was so helpful is that we had a common language, we had a common vision. And so my classroom was just really a reflection of my own practice, trying to get to go with the systems. And, I had a mentor teacher or a coach that would come and support me in getting there. But I think the culture pieces are critical in the success of everything else.
So Rebecca, what are your takeaways from today?
Well, I'm going to be narrating my laps a little bit more. I think I work with girls who don't find it too difficult to pay attention, but I think every time we can illuminate what we're doing and why we're doing it is really helpful. And I think possibly even for me, moving a bit more quickly, getting my steps up around that classroom and getting to every student as quickly as possible. So I saw your pace and I was like, oh, my pace now looks so relaxed by comparison.
I think my takeaway is I really like the ratio of error or ratio of competence that you were talking about before, Denarius, and how if it is 50% or below, obviously reteach. And if it's between 50 and 80, that comparative show call can be powerful. And then the last one I've forgotten, but it's above 80, you've got a choice. You might do a almost correct.
Almost there. Yeah, almost correct. There. I love that better. Yeah.
Almost there show call. And I think I've been doing show call in a lot of my demo lessons around the traps, and I think having that nuance of it's not any random student that you might be calling upon. It's for a particular purpose based on what you're seeing on those laps. I think that just takes it to a completely different level. So I can't wait to put that into action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for being with us, Denarius. It's been such great. This podcast in general is such great professional learning for me and Nathaniel.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, we take stuff straight into our practice, and it's been an inspiration talking to you this morning. If we have listeners who want to send us footage, we are always open to receiving footage and looking at putting that in a future episode. So please do get in touch and make sure you like or follow on one of your favorite podcasting apps.
And a big thank you from us and to everyone at the Teach Like a Champion team, as well as yourself, Denarius Frazier, for being with us today. We really appreciate everything that's happening in that space to help teachers improve their practice. Thanks, everyone.